Okay, yeah, we'll get started. If there's more people to admit, I'll just admit it as we go. So welcome to, this is a bit of a new format for us. So we've never tried doing a webinar before, but we find that this season specifically, we've had a lot of people who are getting into backcountry skiing who just really struggle with finding like the right advice. And then also, it's getting very difficult out there because like I find like even, myself as like someone who has researched lots of things throughout my life on the web, the more we get kind of, into the AI and all those extra sort of tools that we have now, lots of people kind of take a lot of that kind of AI stuff for cash, whether it's like Google AI when you do a Google search or ChatGPT or whatnot. So we thought we just kind of try to like provide a little bit of like extra information and kind of give people some tools. The idea being here, like if you're like an expert skier who has like all your boots dialed, this is like tonight's not necessarily for you. The goal here is really to kind of give people, if you don't have access to a boot fitter locally, or if you are looking for maybe a boot on the marketplace and you don't know where to start, or if you can go try, boots on somewhere locally, but again, like there's no like specialized shop or there's no touring shop, because backcountry skiing boot tends to be like they tend to be quite different to like downhill boots. Okay, so yeah, that's kind of the goal. So tonight the goal is really to kind of give you a good start point on how to like know if a boot fits for you or not, and also know what category you're looking for. One of the really classic things that I use is like, so those who mountain bike are probably going to understand it. And if you've come to the shop before, you probably heard me say that about ski boots, but ski equipment is like mountain biking. So, and when you look at mountain biking, you have like cross-country racing, you have trail riding, you have enduro racing, and you have like riding the bike park, like downhill. And those four different, sports in a way are just are the same sport, but they are quite different in the requirements that you're going to have. And skiing is the same thing, except often what happens is people tend to kind of think, well, skiing is skiing. And skiing is not quite skiing because you have out east, you're going to have people who do, performance carving, or here, some ski instructors are like extremely strong, like hard pack skiers. You're going to have people who just, ski around at the hill. You're going to have racers. You're going to have free riders. You're going to have people who backcountry ski, and you're going to have people who skimo. And all those people technically have different needs when it comes to ski boots. And to say that one ski boot can do everything perfectly is the same as to say that your downhill bike you can take on a cross-country race or a mountain biking marathon. There's no such thing as a boot that can do everything. So for that reason, it's often quite confusing for people. I know on the coast right now, and there's often a lot of people who come in looking for crossover boots, so boots that can do both the hill and the backcountry. Whereas if you're in the Rockies, if you're in the interior right now, for you, a backcountry boot's probably going to be an exclusive use in the backcountry because you will probably get out in the backcountry a lot more because it's a lot more accessible for you. So yeah, so that's kind of what we're getting at. Just maybe a couple seconds to introduce myself. So my name is Joel. I'm one of the owners here at Ski Uphill. I used to be in Canmore for about 10 years, a bit less than that, and I moved to Squamish in 2022 to work at Ski Uphill Coast. You'll still see me around Canmore. I love going back there to backcountry ski in the spring, especially because it's like big line and couloir season. But I'm right now based out of Squamish. I also happen to be a physiotherapist, so I have a degree and a master's in physiotherapy from Laval University in Quebec City. So I do kind of bring a lot of kind of health science and kind of biomechanics knowledge into what I do for work. So yeah, that's basically just kind of who I am. So yeah, I've been working with ski boots for a while now. We opened the shop in 2017 in Canmore, and since then, we've been training a lot of boot fitters. We've been doing quite a bit of work with local skiers. And one of the things that is specific with, I think, Ski Uphill is that we are used to fitting a bit more like mostly backcountry boots. Like we work on everything, but we also work on touring boots, taking into consideration that you're going to go for a walk. And that's often like one of the problems that we find that a lot of shops, especially for example here in Whistler, will kind of fit people for alpine use, and then those people end up having issues often in the backcountry. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me here. So yeah, so we can probably just jump in quickly, and I'm gonna kind of keep looking at the questions here, and I already kind of seen a lot of stuff that's kind of repeatedly used and whatnot. So that's something that we're gonna talk about at the end. But lots of those questions about stiffness and heel hold and stuff, I'll get to when I get to the fit section. Maybe the first thing to kind of talk about is like I said, there's multiple types of mountain bikes. There's multiple types of ski boots, and that also comes with different materials. And I think understanding that is very important because it's going to let you allow you to understand what are your goals versus what you need. If you are looking at you're skiing Whistler or you're skiing Kicking Horse or Lake Reeds and you want a boot where you can get out a few times a year with your friends or go on like a heli ski trip or a cat ski trip versus a boot that will let you do like a bunch of weekends at Rogers Pass and maybe a lot of kind of like a Wapta Traverse and whatnot, you're going to have quite different needs. So we're not gonna cover alpine boots because I don't think it's useful necessarily for the crowd and also really kind of the topic tonight. But we'll start kind of at that sort of in between where basically I call it like a crossover boot. So the first boot you'll often encounter at the ski shop, depending on what you have access to locally, is going to be for us, that's where we start kind of our line. So a crossover is kind of I ski the hill mostly, I dabble into backcountry skiing, my days are not huge. And often those people also want to have a boot that fits in alpine bindings. So a good example is something like an Atomic Hawks. So that's a classic 4-buckle boot. Lots of people are familiar with Atomic if they have been skiing for a little bit. But those boots, typically, the advantage that you get from a 4-buckle like this is that the first thing is that basically cross-compatible with almost everything on the market. If you have skis, downhill skis that are within the last 5, 6, 7 years with downhill bindings, they are likely grip walk compatible, which is the sole compatibility. So this sole, we don't see it super well. We see it a bit better here. The grip walk sole blocks do have an interface that allows for you to step into almost any alpine binding on the market as of now. Those boots typically, like the Hawks, are going to be made out of a heavier plastic called polyurethane. So PU is what a lot of boot fitters are going to use. A PU shell has an advantage that it is a lot damper. So the suspension you get, or how much the boot kind of has give in a really nice even way before it holds you up in your ski position, is a lot less harsh because the plastic has a lot of give. So those polyurethanes are really what's used mostly in all the high quality carving boots and all the high quality crossover boots with the walk mode, but the 4-buckle system. So polyurethane is awesome for downhill. So this is your enduro kind of bike. This is your boot that's meant to kind of take you maybe not super far, or if you're really fit, they can probably take you far, but that's going to get you there, but maybe not super far, or maybe not on some really big days. They come with some significant trade-offs where, for example, the walk mode do have quite a bit of friction. Often they don't walk nearly as well because of that. But if you just look at downhill performance, if you're just purely looking at downhill performance, they will always ski a little bit better because of that dampness, that nice progression, the thick plastic that has a nice give to it, and it just kind of feels like it's a smoother skiing. It's a more suspension, more dampness into the plastic. So those will always ski better. That being said, you don't need a boot like this to ski properly. What I mean by that is that yes, when we look at performance, I think a lot of people assume that performance is this factor of oh, I'm skiing hard. And actually, yes and no. A heavy, thick PU shell with lots of give and lots of dampness and all that is really good for extremely harsh conditions. You would never see a World Cup racer ski in anything else but a PU, a thick polyurethane shell, because they ski a sheet of injected ice. And literally, when you watch a World Cup ski race, you can see that it's not snow, it's actually ice that they're skiing on. Those people need as much support, as much absorption as possible, because it's already so difficult to ski that they need everything they can have to make sure they can actually ski the course, right? So a boot that's PU like that will always obviously ski better. So this is going to be your kind of smoother tool that really kind of lets you go anywhere in the mountain. You don't need something like this to ski hard. And I think a lot of people confuse, oh, I need a 4-buckle because I want to ski hard. And at the end of the day, yes and no, right? Those boots obviously will have a little bit more support. They often run a bit higher on the shin, right? And they're going to, like I said, have a bit more of that dampness. So they won't be as like harsh or as snappy. We call it like responsive. So that is your first kind of category. Some boots, so that's a PU shell, polyurethane. It's the kind of heavier shells. A lot of the brands are going back to polyurethane because those boots are actually used mostly for downhill skiing at the hill. People like are going to go in the backcountry, but not a ton with that kind of equipment. So the brands are really going back to like heavier shells, thicker plastics. And this is overall, give or take, about a pound, a bit over a pound heavier per foot than like a backcountry, a mid of the range kind of backcountry boot. When you go down into that, down into the categories, then you kind of are going to have a few boots like this that use a different material, which I'm going to talk at. So when you kind of go from, that kind of top sort of enduro rig, right? We're going down to a category that's like this guy. That's a Radical Pro from Dynafit. This is like a super, super, super classic do-it-all, right? This is a different plastic. So a boot like the Radical Pro uses actually doesn't use polyurethane because polyurethane is heavy. So it's going to use a plastic called Grilamid or a polyamide plastic, which is awesome for us because it's easy to punch and it's also a lot lighter. So a boot like this will, generally speaking, be about like, a pound lighter, give or take, per foot than the Atomic Hawks right before. The disadvantage in a boot like this is the same stiffness almost than the Atomic. The main difference is the plastic being different. Those Grilamid plastics are a bit more brittle. So they kind of have that kind of harshness to them. Like I often say, it's like a carbon bike. It's like a really snappy, responsive feeling. They don't offer quite as much suspension, right? So in the backcountry, if you're looking at a boot that you're going to go backcountry skiing, chances are you probably will not need something that you can ski like groomer tracks ice with, right? If you have to ski that kind of stuff, you're in the wrong kind of boot. But what I'm trying to say here is that a boot like this will be able to power a really big ski quite easily. Where it's a little bit limited is like in really, really difficult conditions, which typically, that doesn't mean icy. That means a lot of variability and really bumpy and chattery and difficult snow. And realistically, most backcountry skiers never get into that kind of conditions. So a boot like that has the advantage that it will still work in, quite a bit of bindings. So shifts and, some alpine bindings that have multi-norm compatibility. Those compatibilities are quite confusing, but basically the sole blocks are meant to fit into bindings. And in order to release properly in alpine systems, you need to have a boot that doesn't create friction with your binding, because the DIN setting actually that you set up, like the release values of the DIN of whatever number, depends on the absence of friction. So if you put a Radical Pro like this in a binding that's not certified for this shell, then you're creating friction into the system, and that's not going to release properly. So your binding is either going to ski a lot stiffer than it's supposed to, or softer than it's supposed to, or maybe it might be okay, but it's not a system that is rated to be used together. So one thing to keep in mind is if you have a grip walk binding that you want to be compatible with, or a binding that's a full alpine, like, proper descending binding, you will have to check if it is an MNC or multi-norm compatible binding in order to fit with this kind of soles. The advantage of that style of boot is that it just walks like a running shoe compared to something like this. So there's a huge difference in just like how the Grilamid shell and also the range of motions in those boots that don't have the overlap will just walk so much better. So someone is kind of asking, like in the chat box, like how big of a role does a ski boot play in downhill performance versus the ski itself? Well, you need a boot that's supportive enough to ski the size of ski that you want. But I think a lot of people, and I'm on the coast right now, so it's a bit of a biased opinion about that. But in the Rockies, we have less of that problem. But I think one of the biggest issues that we see on the coast is people in gear that's too heavy. And by the time they get to the top of their skin track, they're so tired that they're having a hard time skiing down with good performance. And that's the skier. A boot like this or even a boot that's lighter than that, is plenty of boot for basically anyone out there to go ski normal backcountry conditions and even like some really steep stuff and some pretty gnarly lines. But yes, I think like the one problem here is that everybody thinks that they need more boot than they actually do, and then they end up in the 4 buckle, and then they get to the top of the mountain, they're super tired, and then they're not able to ski anymore. And so there's like that, you know, no one escapes gravity. No one, you know, makes it to the top of the mountain unless you catch a heli ride, you know, fresh like as a daisy. And I think managing that fatigue versus skiing is actually quite important. So this is your first kind of do it all in the boot. This is like our most popular boot. It's super classic. You'll see it everywhere. It fits like a ton of stuff. It's super stiff. It skis very well if it fits you. So yeah. Next category is that becomes a touring exclusive boot. The reason is when you get into some of those boots, like a Ridge Pro or some of that kind of 1,200 gram range. So, you know, the Hawks is 1,800 grams or 1,700 grams. The Radical is like 1,500. This is like 1,280. So it's quite a bit lighter. Again, you're saving quite a bit of weight. But in those shells, you're starting to have a boot that's really more optimized to walk. So often those shells will not fit alpine bindings anymore. So you need a toe piece that has pins in order to interface that. So you lose compatibility. In my case, I have a downhill boot I use for the ski hill, so I don't need a boot that works into ski bindings for the ski hill in my backcountry boot, so I can use a boot like this that only fits in pin bindings. But if you have a shift, then a boot like this will not work, okay? So those boots are lighter, they walk way better, and yes, they will ski a little bit less supportive. I'd say most of them will. This one, the Ridge, is a bit of a specific boot because it's actually quite stiff for the weight. But most boots in that category will be a bit less supportive. And that is where like the ski ability or your skill level comes into play. Because typically, at least what we see is that the strongest skiers, so if someone's like got a ton of experience like in skis, they often, or like a really solid technical skier, they will often have already a stance that is a little bit more centered, and they don't need to rely, like, you know, if they get bucked around, they won't need to rely on the cuff holding them there nearly as much. So they're able to ski on their feet a little bit more. So in the lighter categories, typically, the better of a skier you are, the less of a difference a boot like this will make, because at the end of the day, like good skiing is good skiing. Like good technique is good technique across the board. And a lighter boot just forces you to kind of like ski on your feet a bit more and rely on the cuff a little bit less. But that's an adjustment that most strong skiers can do. If you go into like the lighter categories, like the kilo boot and stuff, that's really a big deal for heavier skiers or beginners, where you don't want to get into equipment that's super lightweight because the amount of like hold it kind of keeps you in the sweet spot is quite low, and then that's like a little bit too much. If you get bucked around and you're not used to having enough balance to really stay on top of the boot, then right away you're going to get like, you know, into the front seat, into the back seat. It's really difficult. So it's not a question of what boot improves your skiing the best. I'd say it's like a question of like how far do you want to go, because no one escapes gravity. What bindings are you using? Because if you are in the Rockies or the interior and you're only in tech bindings, you're like, I already have a resort ski kit. I don't need a second one. You'll likely end up in a tech system because the approaches are quite long. Whereas if you're skiing Whistler here and you just want the boot to go hit like, you know, oboe and spankies and a couple like small little walks or husume, which are like quite close to the resort, then you will get away with something heavier because the heavier boot probably won't be that much of a liability. But if you want to go do like halfway around the spearhead or a big did, the Sea to Sky gondola here in the Whistler area, then that's where you're definitely going to be limited. And I think there's at least as much limitation by how tired you're making yourself by the time you get to the ski part of the day. Then, you know, the stiffness of the boot or the softness of the boot and whatnot. Okay, so this is kind of the categories. Then there's like skimo boots, and there's like a kind of kilo sort of class, like this guy, which is like a kilo, 1,100 grams. Those are like super lightweight. You can walk super far. They're super light. They walk like literally like a shoe. They're really good for like crampon use and ski mountaineering and whatnot. But typically in that kilo category, we start losing a little bit of durability. So for example, like the plastics get really thin and brittle, the buckles get a bit kind of fragile. So typically those are really specialized products that people often use as a second boot. So they have a first boot that's a bit heavier, and they have like a boot for like spring skiing and big traverses and whatnot, and it's like a boot in that kind of kilo class. Okay, so those are the categories of ski boots. So it's like already quite complicated, right? Polyurethane is what we do the big boots in. So those kind of like four buckles, PU. And then all the light boots that are lighter, they're going to be made out of acrylamide or some sort of carbon-infused blends. And the main thing just to remember is that the lighter the boot is, the harsher or the more snappy and responsive it's going to have to be to provide the same amount of stiffness. And it's not a good or bad or better or worse. It's just a question of habit. And yes, I think there's a question of expectation here, meaning that if I ski like a quite stiff, really nice heavy boot at the ski hill, well, I can't expect, and it's okay, that it's going to ski exactly the same on my boot that's half the weight in the backcountry, or that's like saving over a pound per foot in the backcountry. But in the backcountry, I ski softer snow. I don't ski icy moguls. If it's icy, it's a bit more planar typically, so it's less like chattery vibration, kind of chunky. So you don't necessarily need a boot that can do just as much harshness. The same way as if you go pedaling on a mountain bike, why would you take your downhill bike to go like pedal a trail where you have to actually pedal up the mountain, right? So that's the same. I think I really look at it the same way across different categories. The stiffness question is like a really big one, and a lot of people have like a ton of questions for stiffness. It's quite difficult to determine the right stiffness because it depends on the skier. So it depends on how much flexibility your ankles have. It depends on how big your calf is. It depends on like how tall you are, how heavy you are, your foot, kind of like how much flexibility your foot has. Generally speaking, a stiffer boot, so a flex that's higher numbers, like 130 is always more supportive than 110 or then 90. And those stiffness numbers are not objective measurements. The brands just decide whatever they want to call it. So if Atomic says this is 130, well, it's actually kind of relevant only within Atomic because a 130 is stiffer than a 120, which is stiffer than a 110. But Atomic 120 or 110 might still be more boot or less boot than another brand because there's no like universal way of measuring that. It's really just the brands are like, oh, this is about this much. There's no like super clear scale of that. So it's not something that we use quite as much as people think. That being said, typically a stiffer boot means that you have to work harder. So if I'm like on this boot here and I'm pushing into the boot, I want a boot that lets me move over my toes. So I want to be able to bring my knees over my toes in order to be able to push on the front of the ski, okay? So if the boot is too stiff for you, then that's a lot of work and you end up in the back seat because you're not able to push into getting weight on the front of your foot, which is what drives the pressure in the front of the ski. On the other hand, a boot that's too soft for you, you'll probably go through the flex and end up with your knees way too far forward of the front of the boot, and then that's gonna like be really hard to ski, and you're gonna feel like the boot's kind of folding, right? Most skiers are in boots that are a bit too stiff for them. I'd say like broadly speaking, people chase stiffness a little too much, and I think a lot of people would benefit from being in a boot that's a little bit softer than when they're currently in, or than what they choose. People like always like, well, stiffer is better. Well, yes, stiffer is better if you ski like really harsh conditions and it's like really chunky and it's really, you get bucked around a ton and then you're like coming in really fast and you're a super strong skier or whatnot. Yes, a stiffer boot is better. But sometimes a stiffer boot is not better because it kind of like prevents you from moving on your ski properly. And that's not necessarily a better thing, right? So the more experience, the more stiffness, but then also like the more harsh conditions and the more bumpy and the more you're going to get like thrown around, sometimes a little bit more support is good. In a backcountry setting, do we actually ski that kind of conditions? That's like a good question. Like a lot of people do not go out in the backcountry if it's bad skiing. So then do you actually need the stiffest boot out there to go backcountry skiing? Well, I don't really think that's like the case for like at least most people. So stiffer is better, but not necessarily. Stiffer is better if you are like, and it's not so much, I think like people confuse like being a strong, like oh, I'm an aggressive skier. Oh, I'm a strong skier. It's not so much the idea of strength. It's more the idea of like how you're moving on your ski to go pressure the front. So if you're a super strong skier but you ski like nice on your feet, you don't push in your cuffs a ton, you really like work finesse, you don't need a 130 flex. But yes, if you're like someone who like really pushes in the cuffs and likes to like really engage the turn like hard in the front, then you can definitely get a stiffer boot. But it's not so big of a deal in a backcountry setting. So I just like, a word of caution on the flexes. It's like, it seems like, a lot of people kind of confuse sometimes flex with like your worth as a skier, but it doesn't have anything to do with that, right? Like a stiffer boot doesn't mean you ski better. A stiffer boot just means that it's harder to get to the front of the ski. And if it's too hard for you, then it's just too hard for you. And it's too easy for you, then it's just too easy for you. And what matters is to find a solution or a kind of compromise between those two things. So yeah, so typically the stiffness, you want to be able to kind of get to the front of your foot, kind of pressure on your toes, but not go past your knees, not have the knees go past the toes. All right, how do we fit a ski boot? So that's like just categories, materials, compatibility, and then stiffness. And then when we get to how we fit ski boots, it's not that different than alpine. So typically, if I measure my foot, so a Mondo size, so a boot that is a 26, 26.5, that's called a Mondo size. What's a Mondo size? It's actually just a measurement in centimeters. So if I put my foot against a wall, like my heel against a wall, like, heel against all the way to the wall, and I put a ruler at the 0, and I put my foot on top of the ruler, then where the front of my toe will end is going to be like a certain number of centimeters. And that is your Mondo point. So it's not like rocket science. It's just actually another way of saying centimeters. So my foot measures 26.5 centimeters on the right and 26.7 centimeters on the left. I can measure that with a ruler. So as a backcountry skier, what I like to call it the true size, but if my foot is at 26.5 and I am not someone who's like looking for the craziest precision out there and like I kind of actually want to go walking and like some bigger days, then I will try boots in that size. So my foot measures 26.5. I'm going to try 26.5s. There are no half sizes in ski boots, and people get very confused by that. So if you try a 26.0 and you try a 26.5, like both those half sizes, they're the same. Ski brands do not produce a boot like a plastic mold for each half size. They only produce a mold each full size. So most brands, the only one being Scarpa is the only exception, a 23.0 and a 23.5 is the same plastic shell. Sometimes you'll have a thicker liner or a shorter liner. The stitching is going to be a bit tighter. Sometimes the boxes actually say both half sizes. But what's super important here is that if you try a 23.5 and it fits great, and you're like, oh, it's a little bit short, I'm going to try a 24. A 24.0 is a full size bigger, not just a half size bigger. And lots of skiers who come here often get confused with that. So super, super important to understand that there are no half sizes, like properly speaking, in the plastic shells. The half size, we can make it with a boot press and some punching, but a boot only exists in 1 centimeter increments at a time. So if I measure 26.5, I'm going to try a bunch of 26.5. But if I measure 27.0, then maybe I'm going to try some 27.5s because the 26.5 might just be a little bit too short. But generally speaking, how you would assess the length. So I start measuring my foot. I'm at 26.5. Perfect, that's awesome. So then I'm going to grab a boot that's in my size. So let's say this is a 26.5, or actually I have a real 26.5. So the boot says 26.5 here. How I determine if this is the correct length is I'm going to take the liner out and take the bed out of the liner, and I'm going to get into the boot with just my foot in the shell. So I grab all that stuff, I take it out, I grab the footbed, I place it back in the shell, and then I would put my foot in the shell. From that point, I'm going to glide to the front until my toes are resting into the end. Not like curling like this, but also like a little bit more than just feeling, just like, resting in the front. And then I'm going to measure behind my heel with my fingers how much space I have. Typically, 15 millimeters to 20 millimeters of space is what we're looking for. And if you go to a shop like here, you'll hear like 1.5 fingers or 2 fingers or whatever. These are just basically another way of measuring. Like I know that for me, 2 fingers like this behind your foot is about 20 millimeters. And if I have 1.5, it's like more like 15 millimeters. So a backcountry fit should be up to about 20 millimeters of space behind your heel. Some places will use like a scarpa, there's like a little stick you can throw in there. Some people have like dowels of different sizes. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the measurement. So I use my fingers because I'm used to doing it, but other people will use other tool. But if you want to check the fit, you're like a marketplace boot and you're trying to find used, actually take the liner out and put the footbed in there and then throw your foot and have a look at how much space you have. A backcountry fit to go walking for a full day or like 5-6 hours for a person who is a normal skier who doesn't come from like crazy race background and all that should be that measurement 1.5 to 2 fingers or 15 to 20 millimeters between the back of the boot and the back of your heel. Now, one of the things that's super important is that if you go into an alpine shop, like as someone who like does like race fits and a bunch of carvers, if I go into a place that only does like performance alpine boots, and I say my foot's a 26.5, they will bring me a size under that, so a 25.5, because they are assuming that I do not have to walk, and that's a huge, huge, huge deal. The difference is if I, for example, like my personal boots, I run a 26.5 in the backcountry and a 25.5 at the ski hill. At the ski hill, I put my boot on, I walk from the parking lot to the chair, I get off my feet. Then I get on snow, I ski a run, then I get the chairlift, I get off my feet. I'm never actually walking, so my foot's never gliding back and forth as I'm walking and the cuff is moving. So I can get away somewhat comfortably with a much tighter length where I could never walk more than a couple hours with actually quite a bit of pain in a boot that's like a size under. So it's not a matter of, sometimes we'll hear people be like, oh, they told me my boot was too big. And they went to like another shop and like, oh, they told me my boot's too big. And then we measure it and it's 1.5 fingers or 2 fingers. Well, yes and no. If it's that length, it's an adequate touring length, considering that you'll be walking. If you are in a boot that's a size under, like a 1 finger fit or like a 3/4 finger fit, like some people are like really short boots, then it's not a boot that's too small. It's just a boot that is for a different purpose. So I would never walk very far in my 25.5 alpine boots because I don't have the length to let my foot glide around and not smash my toes. So I make the decision to go up to my true size. So I measure 26.5. I got a 26.5 for the backcountry. Obviously, there are cases where people will want to have something that's a little bit smaller, or you can punch and a bunch of other stuff. But generally speaking, if you don't have access to a boot fitter and you're like, or you're looking for marketplace and whatnot, that is your correct size. You measure your mondo with a ruler, you put your foot in the shell, 1.5 to 2 fingers. I can assure you that you will be comfortable walking if your foot is supported and if the boot's been been molded for your foot and a few more kind of hacks. But the shell, the container, the plastic container itself will be the correct length. Cool. So that is really the thing for like the biggest difference between touring and resort skiing is that in the touring world, we can't count on downsizing to make a boot tighter because it just hurts and you lose toenails and you get really cold toes if you're like in cold weather. And then you like smash your toes when you boot pack and it just sucks. And foot pain is not supposed to be a thing that stops you from going backcountry skiing. The other thing that is a bit tricky with alpine versus touring is that in touring boots, we don't have an LV or an MV. So there's only one volume. Like Dynafit makes one radical and that's the space it has. And if it's too much for you, then that's too bad because there's no other choice. So the fit of the boot will dictate a bit more what works for you and what doesn't work for you. Cool. So once I check in this, and I know that this 26.5 here is the correct length. I've checked it. It's 2-finger fit. Okay, perfect. I want a boot to go walking, to be comfortable all day. Then I'm going to grab this. I'm going to reinstall the liner in there, and I'm going to try it this time with the liner. And if the boot works, if it's a brand new boot that you try, if I try a 26.5 and my foot's 26.5 and I try a brand new shell, so first time, never skied before, not heat molded, I'm going to feel the front. I'm going to like brush the end or maybe have a little bit of toe pressure, but that is the correct size. Even in a backcountry boot, when it is brand new out of the box, you should be feeling the front at least a tiny bit because the liners are very, very thick. Like that's a big pillow. It's only going to get much bigger, like much roomier. Boots will never feel nearly as tight as when they're brand new. And a heat mold, for example, in the oven will already take care of often over a half size of space. So it is normal and expected that if you try even a boot that has like enough space to be a backcountry boot where you're comfortable all day walking, you will still feel the front when they're brand new out of the box. And then that's a really common mistake that people make. You're supposed, before heat molding the shell, to feel the front a bit. If you're like there searching and it's not there, it's probably because the boot's a little bit big for you. And then that's where often we start having issues with volume and blisters and whatnot. So a brand new boot should be slightly short, should feel at least slightly short when it's brand new, even for a backcountry boot. When you're putting it into ski mold and buckling it out and then you flex into the front, like you push in the cuff, then your toes should get off the end. And that's an indicator that the boot's probably the correct length. Okay? The fit in general, when people try a boot on for the first time, they put their foot in, okay, they feel the front a little bit. The most important thing is that there's no empty space. So I would rather have someone who tells me like, I couldn't ski a full day in this, than someone who tells me like, this feels amazing. Because a boot that is brand new shouldn't feel quite amazing because it's at its, by far, its tightest it's ever going to feel. So a perfect fit is something that you're like, wow, this is like a 7 out of 10. Like it's a firm handshake. There's definitely no space. Maybe there's like 1 or 2 little pressure points, which is super easy to fix most of the time, but it's locked in. That's like the perfect fit. The perfect fit is like, okay, I feel the front a little bit. Then I push in the cuffs. Oh, my toes get off the front. It's comfortable. It's like super locked in. It's a little bit tight. I don't think I could do a full day in this. I could do maybe a couple hours at the ski hill, but I'd want to take them off. Oh, yes. That's exactly what we're looking for in a brand new boot. If you're shopping for your used boot, then the liners are been worn. So often what you get trying the boot on, if it's been skied a decent amount, is what you get, period. So it kind of makes it more simple in a way because the boot's already kind of broken in and it's already expanded to having more space. So yeah, so that is the kind of ideal fit. Even if it's backcountry skiing, we're still looking for something that's precise because that responsiveness and precision is what makes your skiing better. So to kind of get back to something that someone was saying earlier as a question is it's not necessarily the stiffness that is like the most important thing. It's the precision. Having a boot that has responsiveness that holds you really well into a locked position where any movement of your foot makes the ski do something. That precision, people often confuse it. Oh, my boot's too soft. I need a stiffer boot. And often what they actually say is my boot's not precise enough. So as a result, because I'm swimming around, then they're having a hard time controlling their skis, so they're pushing even harder. But a boot, a precise fit, is like the the keystone in good skiing. Like whether it's in the backcountry or at the ski hill, the difference being that we're a bit more forgiving in the backcountry because of the walking kind of component that we typically don't have at the ski hill, where we can get off our feet whenever we want. Okay. Boots will have different volumes. So some boots will feel super baggy. Like you're gonna try a boot on and be like, oh wow, this is like there's a bunch of space behind my heel or around my heel or around my calf or around the middle of my foot, and I can move side to side. Like I mentioned earlier, the best boot is the boot that locks you in when there's zero empty space, brand new. And that doesn't happen all the time. And there's some, sometimes it's impossible, right? Some people have like really, really skinny feet that don't have a lot of meat on them, and it's difficult to kind of provide a good hold. But if you're just gonna into the basics of choosing for yourself, that is the guideline that we use here. So yeah, that's just like a general kind of overview of how to select a ski boot. So the first thing is, what are you going to do with it? How much walking versus how much not walking? Realistically, if you're just going to use it for the backcountry, you probably shouldn't be in a 4-buckle boot because you're just kind of adding weight. And like I said, gravity is universal. So that's just going to make you tired for no reason. Then once you know a bit what category you're looking for and what bindings you're going to have, then you look at, okay, well, what's my foot length? Okay, and then you try boots in that size. And then that's going to tell you, once you've kind of measured them and you know that they're the correct length and you try them with a liner, that this is an adequate fit for you. And that is, it's going to be tight enough. And the biggest problem we see almost all the time is people who have boots, they come in and they complain about their boots being too soft or they don't ski well. And it's most of the time because their boots are too baggy for them. They're just swimming and they're not held in a good enough way. And a boot that you're moving around will cause blister issues, shin bang issues, some like weird calf stuff. Your foot's gonna go kind of funny, and then you're gonna, bang your toes to the front, even though the boot's a little bit big, because you're just not held in a solid stance. And that is the main thing about choosing any ski boot, whether it's like a World Cup race boot all the way down to a Skimo World Cup super light shell. Okay. So that's kind of just like the trying on and the sizing process. And I'm just really hoping that this kind of gives you guys tools to kind of know a little bit what to search for, because yes, like marketplace, some people have like special prices. Other people have friends who have old boots, and other people just walk into a shop and it's sports experts or whatever, and they just don't know, right? And it happens, right? Like we're lucky enough here that we live in a ski community, but in a lot of cities, like there's not that much backcountry skiing out there. But always be mindful if you are going to a shop and you measure 26 or 23.5 and they throw you in a size under that, and you're wanting to backcountry ski, it will probably always hurt. Okay, so just like, and that's the thing we see a lot with like race shops, like who kind of like size people really short. Okay, we do have a blog post on our website that summarizes what I just talked about, like how many fingers of space in the back and how tight should it feel and all that. But typically, really, if you're getting into backcountry skiing, like I always tell people, 2 fingers behind the heel, a snug fit, a nice locked in fit where your foot is not crushed, but also slightly uncomfortable when the boot is brand new. And then flex wise, like, don't go with something that's crazy stiff if it's your first ever boot and you don't have a huge amount of mileage at the ski hill. But also get something that has unless you're really only going to ski the backcountry a handful of times in your life, most people who get like a boot that has a poor walk mode end up swapping to a boot that has a better walk mode down the road. So make sure you have a boot that walks good enough for the size of the day you're planning on doing. Okay, so it should feel nice. It's not supposed to feel like you're walking in a cast. Okay, again, like most of the time in the backcountry, we walk about 90% of the time and we ski maybe 10% of the time, right? So that walking component is extremely important. And the precision of your boot and how well it fits you is more important than how stiff it is in order to like guarantee good skiing. Okay. So that's kind of what I have here about like lengths and just like fitting in general and just kind of like general, like what's the categories and all that. We can kind of go over a couple maybe common issues that people get. And I mean, it becomes very quickly a case by case, and that's why, that's why we spend hours and hours and hours punching boots here, like all day, every day in the winter, both in Cameroon and Squamish, is that at the end of the day, what's super important to understand is that this is a square Tupperware. This is like like an atomic boot is atomic saying, well, an average foot kind of looks like this, so we're going to make a boot look like this. But then, like, average is just like extremely non-specific. And if you have like a bunion or a foot that's way longer than the other, or like a broken ankle, or like those kind of things, the brands don't account for that in average. So that's super important to be aware that those lasts that the brands have, they're just like, what decided that the Tupperwares were that size? They just decided, well, this is a good size, we're going to make them that size. Doesn't mean it fits all your food. Well, the same way, it's not because the brand says that's a ski boot that your foot should fit in this perfectly. So that's where trying a bunch of stuff really kind of matters. But that's also where it's normal to like need, like if you have a big bump on your foot or something that's very specific, it's normal. I'd say here at Ski Uphill, I want to say at least 50% of the boots that get out of here get one punch. Like an ankle bone is a bit bigger. Oh, I broke this. Oh, I have a bunion, right? And this is not things that are kind of within the average parameters of a ski boot last. So it's normal to need to customize those boots because, like I said, it's just a square box. And you're trying to put your unique foot in this. And a lot of those kind of pain issues are often solved relatively easily. To just kind of, there's someone here asking, the question is, what are the most important tips related to ski boots that every beginner should know? Well, a couple tricks maybe to finish, because that's pretty much all I had to say here for like, boot trying and whatnot, is the first thing is get yourself a nice sock that doesn't bunch. Okay, that's going to like, it doesn't matter how thick or thin it is that much. Like some people like padding, other people don't like padding. Get yourself something that is nice and adjusted, that doesn't roll and bunch around when you're in a ski boot. That's going to save you a lot of problems. The second thing is, and that's something that is always a bit tricky because it's like an extra amount of money, and the boots are often quite expensive when they're new, is if someone comes in to Ski Uphill and they see me and they have like some pain in their boots and a bunch of issues, the first thing that we always look at is the stance, are we supported and are we neutral? And that's like a bunch of like jargon just to say that like basically a ski boot is a clamp on your foot. So if your foot collapses and rolls in and whatnot, when you're clamping on it, it's not going to stay in its like neutral shape. It's going to flatten and like splay and change shape. So a footbed, like doesn't have to be a custom footbed. 80-85% of the people are actually perfect in like a $50, $60 aftermarket with like, a high, mid, low kind of thing. But a footbed will help your foot keep its neutral shape when you clamp down on it. And that is like super important because that's the basic of ski boots, is that we're compressing your foot in this clamp. And then as your foot fatigues, if there's nothing to hold it into its neutral shape, then that's where like you start having arch cramps and foot pain and a bunch of weird stuff and like burning pain and all those is really, really often caused by the fact that we're not supported. And then we clamp the foot down so the foot just flattens and then ends up just being painful. So that staying in the neutral and supported stance. So get yourself a footbed. Like if you have like blister issues, if you have arch cramping, if you have like any of those things, and you don't have a footbed that matches your arch shape, I mean, there's a couple exceptions out there, but for most people, the footbed is the biggest fix to just improve your all-day comfort in a ski boot because of the compressive nature of the boot. So the sock, a footbed, And then from there, just being okay with like it's okay to need a punch. Like it's not like a failure. You know, like most people, like I said, like at least 50% of our people here need a punch somewhere because we put them in a precise fit, and then maybe their toes are a little bit stuck, and maybe they have a bunion or like a big ankle bone or something, and that's just like part of the process because we all have unique feet, but there's no unique boot. They're all just averages. And that is a really kind of, complex process for a lot of people. But if you start with something that follows the basic rules, we're going to be able to make it work a lot better. Any boot fitter will make it work a lot better with a boot that is the correct size and that is nice and snug. Much better than a boot that's super baggy and a size too big. Okay. So yeah, that's kind of pretty much what I have to kind of say here. And I just kind of hope that it kind of gave people some ideas or some guidelines into kind of like boot work and whatnot. I responded a little bit of like the kind of blistering issue. Blistering is really difficult, okay? It's like a mix of like how sweaty your feet get, what your sock is, how much space you have in the back of the boot, how much flexibility you have in your calves, like on your ankles actually, and then like how much your boot has the friction and the range of motion or not. So it's very multifactorial. So it's a bit tricky for blisters, but typically, like the most of the time, like I'd say the general issue when someone has a blistering problem, there's two things. They're often either not tight enough in the heel pocket, so we have to like fill some space with some pads or a liner, or they need a footbed because they are like rolling in when the boot is clamped, and then they just kind of rub really hard only on one side. And that's kind of typical when people have blistering on the inside of the heel, okay? But like I said, that's not a remedy for everything because there's more complexity in like blistering and gliding and pressure points than just like a cookbook recipe at the end of the day. So that's a little bit tricky. But the heel hold, like if you say like, your heel should always be held really nicely. And it's maybe the one last thing, because it's getting complicated, is when you flex into the ski boot and the person at the shop says, can you lift your heels? Yes, everybody can lift their heels out of a ski boot if they try to pick it up. Okay, like if I run like even a super short boot and I push on my toes, my heel's gonna come up. But what the question is if you're flexing in the cuff here, you shouldn't feel like the heel wants to pick up and slide out of the pocket. And it should feel like it's not able to move sideways left and right either. And that's the heel hold. If you just look at it like, oh, can I push my heels out? Yes, everybody can always push their heels out unless you're like in a ridiculously small boot. Okay, so those are kind of some of the basics. There's definitely a lot of like weird stuff with like split board boots and whatnot, but that is some of the more like one-offs kind of thing. So yeah, if you are looking for maybe a bit of this is recorded, so I can probably reshare it, okay? But one of the things that we have on our website is we have in our blog post right now, one of the latest ones is like a backcountry skier's guide to boot fitting. And it just kind of covers those points about, hey, what's your foot looking like? How do you measure that? How do you measure a shell? How do you make sure it's tight enough? What are the common issues? And that just summarizes what I just talked about, but just in writing instead. And you're always welcome, if you're local to any of our two shops here in Squamish or in Canmore, you're always welcome to, book an appointment here for boot shopping, which we don't charge you anything, it's free, or book an appointment for boot work if your boots are causing you issues. Like, I don't believe people should be in pain when they go skiing, okay? Like, you should be in a precise boot, but there's no reason you shouldn't be able to do 10 hours in that pair of boots. Like, and at the end of the day, like, obviously, if you're, we have people in the summer or the spring, and they come and they say like, my boots hurt, and I'm like, okay, and they didn't hurt all season. I'm like, okay, and then I did a 15-hour day. I'm like, well, my boots will also hurt after a 15-hour day because it's plastic, right? So that's one thing to also keep in mind is that tolerance, like at some point, most people cannot spend 12 plus hours in a ski boot without having, or even like 8 sometimes, without being a little bit sore and because it's quite harsh, right? So there's also a question of like sometimes a little bit of expectation, and also understanding that that kind of tolerance also gets built over a season. And if you go from 0 to hero, then also your feet are going to suffer from that because you don't have the resilience in your body to like handle that kind of stuff. Cool. So yeah, that's kind of what I have to say here. So I'm going to stick on for a couple minutes, but if you have any questions or a bit more specific, I'm going to stick around for a few minutes and you can unmute yourself and ask. And otherwise, like, thanks for joining. And then next week, we'll cover ski bindings. So we'll talk about tech bindings and alpine bindings and shifts and all this stuff that's super complicated. But we'll do that on Wednesday, the 26th at 7 p.m. MST or at 6 p.m. PST. So yeah, thanks for joining, and we'll see you on the slopes. I know with the Rockies and interior skiing and the coast, it's a little sad right now. Lots of sad skiers walking around town, but it's coming. And yeah, I'm seeing some good skiing coming up in the interior and the Rockies, that's for sure.